We got Bitcoin, we have Ether, we have Dogecoin at the bottom. There's another Shiba Inu there. The two of those are worth 80 billion. I mean, I know that you probably think that Bitcoin is here to stay. Do you think all of these different crypto assets are real and here to stay, or is there something to be concerned with? And do we need oversight so that people aren't left holding the bag for some of these things, whether they do or not? I'm not predicting one way or another.
I do think that Bitcoin is here to stay, and I think a lot of the others are not. The fact that Bitcoin is fully decentralized and that some of these others were issued by a person or an entity that kept a large block of the coin for themselves and then issued others to participate means they look more like a security than a commodity. Bitcoin is clearly a commodity. It is digital gold. So I do think that having a regulatory framework within which this can exist and innovate, meaning this entire space of digital assets, but that protects consumers at the same time is extremely valuable. And that's why we in the Financial Innovation Caucus are, even as we speak, putting together and reviewing the legislation we have crafted to address these and other issues. Bitcoin is the standard. Everything else has to be monitored differently because they are created differently.
Happy Bitcoin Tuesday, freaks. It's your boy, Matt Odell, here for another Citadel Dispatch. I know it's been a while since our last proper Bitcoin Tuesday, but I have not forgotten about y'all. We have a great conversation lined up for today, and I have great conversations lined up for the next 4 weeks in a row. Bitcoin Tuesdays are coming back strong. Next week, we're going to have Bitcoin Q&A for a nice, tight Bitcoin beginner-focused conversation. Then we're going to have Raw Avocado and Waxwing on. Waxwing will be joining us for a second time. And then we're going to have Eric Sirion on with the Simple Bitcoin Wallet Maintainer and Fiat Jaff, discuss Fedimints and federated Lightning wallets. Pretty excited about that with Tommy and eCash. This is Citadel Dispatch, the interactive live show about Bitcoin distributed systems, privacy, and open source software. Specifically, this is Citadel Dispatch 42. We're going to be focused on security-focused Bitcoin nodes, specifically Nick's Bitcoin, who's currently having some issues. So he is not with us right now, but he should be joining shortly, the lead maintainer of Nick's Bitcoin. Shout out to the Ride or Die freaks who continue to support the show, even though I've been traveling. You guys keep it ad-free and sponsor-free. So we can just focus on actionable Bitcoin discussion. The easiest way to support the show is to go to newpodcastapps.com, pick a podcasting app, search Citadel Dispatch, press the subscribe button, load it up with sats, and stream sats directly to my node. You can also donate via Paynim at citadeldispatch.com. My Paynim's Odell, very easy to remember, or through tippin.me if you want to just do a regular Lightning payment. As you know, I appreciate you guys. You guys make it what it is. Awesome. Nick's Bitcoin just joined us, just in time for me to finish up my intro. Today we have Jonas joining us, Nickler on Twitter. He works with Blockstream for research, and he's been a contributor to Nick's Bitcoin. We have Vivek here, good friend, who helped set up this conversation. Always appreciate him. I just saw him in Austin. He is business development at Blockstream, and we have the lead maintainer of Nick's Bitcoin himself, that goes by Nick's Bitcoin Dev. So I'm just going to be calling him Nick's for the remainder of the show. How's it going, guys?
Great. Great to
So-
be here.
Hopefully, yeah. Nix, you wanna say hi to the freaks? Let's see if your audio is horrible still.
So optimistic. Hi, freaks. Hi, everybody.
You sound way better. Did you set up audio drivers on Nix? Is that what was happening?
No, it's the usual Linux thing with Pulse Audio and ALSA interfering. It's super complicated. I just figured it out on Graphene OS.
Awesome. Well, freaks, he did it. He did it for you guys. So everyone should appreciate that. So, I mean, we're going to focus here to start with. We're going to focus on Nix and Nix Bitcoin. And then the conversation is we're going to take it, we're going to go wider with it. This will be a more technical conversation, but that's how we like it here on Dispatch. Just a reminder that this conversation builds on the conversation we had with Andrew Chow and Craig Raw on reproducible builds and building from software, which was Citadel Dispatch 37. So if you haven't listened to that, consider listening to that after this live show. Don't leave us. So I think a good place to start here is what is Nix OS, and why should we care as Bitcoiners that it exists?
Jonas, you want to take this one?
I think it's a good place to start, but before we do that, I would just like to make this correction that I know it's super confusing, but Nix Bitcoin Dev is not the lead maintainer of Nix Bitcoin. But that's me, and I'm not saying this.
Brutal.
I'm just saying this so the responsibilities are clear. If someone merges bullshit, then that's my fault and not Nix Bitcoin Dev's fault.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry about that, and I appreciate the correction, but that is pretty confusing.
Yeah, it is super confusing. So why did you choose the name?
Yeah, I choose the name because Nix Bitcoin was actually how I started to really get into programming with Jonas back in the day. So I didn't have any better ideas, and I just picked a purpose-built nickname, I guess. Also, back then I was into Samurai, and one of the devs there is Samurai Dev, so I just thought I'd go with it.
Yeah, okay. So I hope that's cleared up now.
That was a good clarification. We appreciate that.
Perhaps I guess it goes a bit too deep if we already start with Nix OS. Perhaps we should first talk about Nix Bitcoin, because if you use Nix Bitcoin in the way that is documented in the repository, you don't have to deal that much with Nix OS. You earn all the benefits, but you don't have to learn everything about Nix OS. So Nix Bitcoin is a node project, you could call it. Perhaps people know what that is from Raspi Blitzes and Umbrel and Nodal and whatever else is there. And I started this project in November 2018 because I guess, as many people, I just set up too many Bitcoin nodes in my life already at that point. And now at that time, I wanted to set up a new one just for Lightning. And then I thought, man, there must be a more systematic way to do this. Like, how can we do this? We could write shell scripts or whatever, but I don't like this. I wanted to have a systematic way that's also easily extensible in the future. And then I remembered my colleague, Russell O'Connor, who's working on simplicity at Blockstream. He gave a presentation at a Blockstream offsite on Nix OS. And I thought, well, maybe Nix OS is a thing that we could build this on. And I started doing that, mostly just published my own node configuration, basically. And then Nix Bitcoin Dev started contributing, started running it on his node, and then more people started contributing. So we have like 3 regular contributors now, I would say, with Eric Arstead and a couple of drive-by contributors and a few users that even use that for their infrastructure. Okay, so now to get to the question, what is Nix OS? When I started this project, I said I just shared my own configuration. What that means is that I had this NixOS system, an operating system, and I was able to share this whole configuration in a GitHub repository. So people could clone this repository and rebuild the exact same operating system that I was running. And this is the power of NixOS, basically, or perhaps to go into this a bit more systematically. NixOS is a declarative operating system. Okay. Regular users, when they work with their operating system, either they have a MacBook or whatever, and if they want to change some setting, they go into their system settings and change their setting and click apply, and then the setting is changed. Similarly, if you work on a server, you SSH into the server, you change your HTTPD configuration and restart the service, and then your change takes effect. NixOS is different. In NixOS, you have a configuration file that specifies the whole system. It tells NixOS how the system is supposed to look like in the end, and NixOS is responsible for building this system. So you write the configuration file, and then you say, okay, the command sounds a bit weird, but it's called NixOS rebuild switch. And then your system, your operating system, will be built based on this configuration file. Okay, so this is like the basic NixOS stuff. It has a few other advantages, but what Nix Bitcoin now adds is you have simple options for Bitcoin-related things. So in your configuration, you can say bitcoind.enable equals true, or bitcoind.port equals 8336, or C-Lightning enable equals true, and a lot of other modules that we maintain. And you don't have to SSH into your system or whatever, download certain things. You only have to add this option, and that way you can build that system.
So Jonas, are you saying this is like a bitcoin.conf file, but for like multiple nodes and services all in one, I guess, software?
To a certain extent, yes, because it's also a text file. But if you've looked at a Bitcoin configuration file, it has a very simple structure, right? It just says prune equals 550 or listen equals 1. But the configuration files in NixOS are written in the Nix language. So that means that you write your configuration in a programming language, which means that you have a lot of advantages in writing your configuration, because you can write your configuration in a very powerful way. You can, for example, you can define variables. Yeah. You can reuse code. You can do all these things. You have types, so you don't mess up ports with strings, etc. So that is really one of the main advantages for me, why I think NixOS really is the systematic way to build infrastructure.
But Jonas, what you just said, I don't want it to scare off new users in the configuration.nix right now. It's all nicely documented. So most of what a new user would be doing is commenting out single lines, just removing the hashtag sign from that line. So it's definitely on par with usability of a bitcoin.conf file, if not even easier, I'd say.
But for the freaks understanding, Jonas, what is, I guess, the Nix functional programming language? Like, how does it differ from object-oriented programming? Like, what is functional?
Functional means that you don't have mutation. So you generally don't have variables that could change their values. You basically just have constants. You have an input, And then you have functions operating on that input to produce an output. So in the case of NixOS, your input is a configuration file, your output is a running system.
Got it. And then I guess because it's functional, it's reproducible as well. And then every dependency also has a SHA-SUM, and you can all rebuild the exact same packages. Is this correct?
I wouldn't say that this is a consequence of being functional, but that's certainly also one of the advantages. I mean, the functional aspect mainly helps you deal with complexity because you're not going to write spaghetti code because you're not able to, basically. You can only write functions, which should be relatively simple. But as you said, what Nix also provides you, okay, perhaps it's a good time now to talk about. We're already getting really deep into.
Yeah, we got deep very
One more
quickly.
thing before we go deeper, that I'd say that Nix Bitcoin is the most anti-spaghetti code project of all time, because we have Eric Arstead in our team who goes through every pull request meticulously, fixes every point, refactors the whole code base at least monthly. So it's really,
shout out to Eric. He's a Nix black belt.
So first of all, to the freaks, as always, I mean, feel free to put questions in the live chat. We will get to your questions. I will also probably be asking questions that you're thinking of without necessarily verbalizing them, because a lot of this is over my head and I'm learning as well, which are my favorite types of conversation. To start here, if you're just an average freak and you're running, let's say you're running a Raspberry Blitz on a Raspberry Pi, and you want to try Nix Bitcoin out, it doesn't run on a Raspberry Pi, correct? You need different hardware, and like how does that start? How does that walk us through setting up your Nix Bitcoin node?
First of all, Nix Bitcoin does run on Raspberry Pis. I think Jonas's brother has it running on Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
And also, it's very easy to start working with Nix Bitcoin because of the container and VM code that Eric in large part wrote, which allows you to basically start up a Nix Bitcoin node on your own laptop to start playing with it. And once you want to go build a 24/7 running node, you just get a off-the-shelf standalone either single board computer or a real beefy server, and follow the install.md, and you should be running a Bitcoin node without any major issues.
But perhaps more in detail, what the Nix Bitcoin tutorial would tell you to do essentially is to install NixOS on your target platform, which could be Raspberry Pi, Intel NUC, or some people run it on an APU C4, I think it's called. And we have a list of hardware in the README. So basically you install NixOS there, and then you can, from your personal computer, you can deploy then the Nix Bitcoin system on this blank NixOS machine.
And it also works on like virtual boxes and other things, correct? So if they just want to experiment with it, the freaks can.
Yep, and they don't have to really install VirtualBox for that. They could just go into the example folder and run one of the examples, which would automatically run in a VM or in a container. The only requirement there is that you have the Nix package manager installed on this machine where you're running this. And perhaps I should mention that before you deploy Nix Bitcoin, you go into the example folder, and there you have a configuration.nix, and that's the example configuration.nix, which has documentation and like it has a lot of options commented out, so you can just remove the pound symbol and activate things like Lightning, C Lightning, or LND, or whatever.
Join market, pool, everything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So
And
if you look
also,
at
if you
that,
want
it
a
doesn't
real
look.
life,
Yeah.
if you want a real life example, which always helps me when I start learning something, you can go to our GitHub organization, and the second repo there is nixbitcoin.org, which actually gives you the full server configuration of our own internal project node. And that will give you a really nice, quick example of how a basic setup would look like.
Awesome. Okay, so before we get deeper, I'm running Raspberry Blitz, right? A lot of the freaks are running Raspberry Blitz. The main advantages of switching to Nix Bitcoin, or at least testing it out and considering a switch, is that it is more transparent what you are running, and it is ideally a more secure setup, all said and done. Would you agree with those two comments?
Matt, I can expand on like I guess my whole node journey because
Yeah, do that.
yeah, so
In short, I would agree.
In short, I would also.
yeah. So I mean, I started off just in 2017, just like a lot of the freaks, a complete pleb. It was only because of UASF I finally ran a node, but it was pitiful because I didn't know how to verify my own transactions because I was still in the trying to decentralize the network mentality or whatever. Fast forward to 2018, where I was fortunate enough to attend Ellen Hack Day. Rootsall, Jonas's younger brother Constantine, Merch, Renee, and Jeff, also Fulmo. They were very kind to like have patience and explain to me how to run a Raspberry Blitz, storing the seed, and everything like that. And that's where I finally learned. Simultaneously, this is around the time that Pierre Rochard put out his node launcher. So all this was fantastic. It was really cool. But going forward, I wanted to have a node, just like Jonas mentioned, that I don't have to figure out like necessarily what broke if something did break in my package manager. This recently happened to me as something as simple as like with Homebrew, Pip, and trying to get a Jupyter notebook to work for Jimmy Song's book on a MacBook. So that mentality kind of stuck with me, where I want something that I figure out once that's a config file that I could kind of keep handy somewhere, and I could just use that same config to almost rebuild the exact node. And that's when Jonas helped me through this a bit more, and it was intriguing because there's also quote unquote atomic rollbacks in this, where if something were to break, then I could just go back to the last build that worked. So for these certain reasons, I thought it was worth the steep learning curve to proceed down this path.
My node journey was pretty much the exact same, only that it was paired with my paranoia, which made me use Debian from the get-go. But I always had a huge issue also with maintaining such a node because you constantly have to SSH in and change things. And yeah, so at some point, and I was always using Electrum with it. And at some point, the Electrum server project went all Bcache, and I decided to trash that node and start working with Jonas. And my first thing was the Electrum Rust server. And from there, we just kept on improving it. And from my side, I think I brought a lot of the security conscious thinking into it. And we have some security features right now in Nix Bitcoin. We'll get into it probably in depth later that I haven't seen anywhere else, and especially not with other Bitcoin nodes. So that's a major advantage.
Yeah, I also think everything is kind of moving in that trajectory, right? Even with Bitcoin Core and having bootstrappable builds, as Carl Dong has brought up with Geeks, everyone's trying to figure out a much more methodical approach to these sort of things. But So
Awesome. I think that was very helpful to both me and the rest of the freaks. I would say I'm on a similar journey, but I just haven't discovered Nix Bitcoin yet. So my journey stops there.
If security is what you're looking for, which I'm pretty sure most people who run a node are, because first of all, they want freedom and also they want their funds to stay secure. I think the learning curve is more than worth taking up, because I can get into very in detail the advantages, but I've looked at some of the other code, and this is not to talk badly about the other node project, but I've looked at the code, and none of the security features we and the work we put in I see in the other nodes. Plus, it's more spaghetti code, which always yields insecurity. So what Jonas also said with shell scripting, and what you also said, Matt, about transparency and system configuration, I think that's already half of security. There is knowing exactly what runs on your node and having just really what you absolutely need running there. No unnecessary ports, no unnecessary print servers whatsoever. And I think you can't get that with a shell script in the same way that you can with NixOS. I like to give the example that when I started working with Debian, I tried to deinstall every single package before I set up my Bitcoin node, which every single time broke the entire system. So I can say from experience that NixOS offers security conscious users something that no other node project does. Also, privacy-wise, we have everything locked behind Tor on multiple levels, on the individual application level, on the system D service level, and even on a network namespace level. We'll get into that later, I'm sure. But from a privacy perspective, also, you don't want some mistake to leak your personal information out to the world. And this financial stuff is very sensitive, personal information. So I feel very safe with Nix Bitcoin because everything has multiple layers of security, which are all very transparently laid out and reviewed constantly.
So, I mean, from my point of view, historically speaking, Bitcoin node security was mostly focused on the privacy level, like you said, because when we use a traditional Bitcoin node with on-chain Bitcoin, your keys aren't held on the node. So you have privacy risk, but if someone compromises your node, it's not the end of the world in terms of actually losing funds. But now that Lightning is in play and we have these hot wallets with a growing amount of money in them that are always connected to the internet, security has become way more important from my perspective, and I assume from most Bitcoiners' perspectives. And also on top of that, the fact that with Lightning, there's no really easy way to back up. You have this situation where reliability becomes really important, where you need to be able to count on your node. You want to have as much uptime as possible, and you don't want anything to get corrupted or have any kind of issues in that regard. So, I mean,
that's also a unique advantage of Nix Bitcoin, is that one system goes all the way down from a Raspberry Pi to a ZFS-enabled redundant power supply enterprise server. And the same review work we put into the Raspberry Pi and the same knowledge we get back from users of the Raspberry Pi goes into the enterprise node and vice versa. And I think having this approach maximizes the improvements you make on the node, and that's what it's really about, is learning from mistakes and reviewing and having transparent code that you can fix easily and constantly.
Yep, I think that's a very important point. I think Nix Bitcoin can only focus on security because NixOS is the methodical way to set up a system, because the goal of Nix Bitcoin is to manage complexity, essentially. And if you add things up to a running system, it will get exponentially more complex very quickly. So how do you add security to such a system? You will have holes. It's unavoidable. So what we really try to do is keep this as simple as possible, and we do that, which I tried to explain earlier, by basically using the concepts of abstraction and reusability of code, because you treat your infrastructure as code. You treat your server as code. And because it is code, it can be reviewed on GitHub, for example. I think this is what, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to set up such a sophisticated system as Nix Bitcoin with 3 spare time contributors, basically.
So Nix Bitcoin Dev kept saying you guys have additional security features in place that aren't in place in other node projects. And he said we could talk about it later. I feel like now's a great time to talk about it. What do you guys think?
Okay, I'm so ready. So
I think that's great. I think the thing that sold me even more on Nix Bitcoin or Nix OS was the whole pseudo vulnerability that happened, and how they, they had do-as, so they didn't necessarily go through that issue. I'd love to hear both of them elaborate on that.
So that's actually, I would be flowing into it naturally. First of all, Jonas, the reason why it took him such a long time to set up Bitcoin nodes manually, I think, is because he always did it the right way, which means having one user per service, et cetera, and other node projects don't have that. They run everything under one user, which makes it simple. But we don't do that, and we have every single service running under a different user with fine-grained permissions between services. When Lightning Loop needs to read certain things from LND, the service gets that permission, but nothing more. So that's the very first step, is using Linux properly. Then we go on to System D, which, people have different opinions about it, but in our use case, it made so many things easier that you have a long list of security features and even an auditing tool, System D internal, which you can run over a service configuration, and it will tell you exactly what kind of hardening options you still can enable, which ones are already enabled. And we just basically went through that list and turned on everything until something broke. And right now, that's the status we're still holding at, which is everything possible that System D offers in terms of hardening is enabled. That goes from private temporary directories, firewalling on a service level, on and on, just privilege escalation protections, which wouldn't exist normally. Jonas probably can think of a lot. It's around 30 or 40 hardening settings. And then we go even further to the actual packages that are being used. Again, we have an extremely minimal footprint. Whatever you enable in configuration.nix, only that and its dependencies are ever deployed to the node. And every package we maintain ourselves is GPG verified if possible. And we're slowly bringing that into upstream as well. Which is basically taking care of supply chain vulnerabilities. But that's definitely the biggest construction site we still have. And what else am I forgetting, Jonas, security-wise?
Jonas, can you go over like how the, I guess, atomic rollbacks are possible with the way it's designed, essentially with the Nix store versus the traditional like file system hierarchical standard?
Okay, that's, I think, a good question. So what this rollback means is that, let's say you have your configuration, you make a change, you deploy it, you notice that your system doesn't work anymore. What can you do? Well, one thing is to just boot up, and in the boot screen of NixOS, just say, I don't want to run the current revision, I want to use an earlier deployment. And that way you can make a rollback. How does that work? That goes into the reproducibility aspect of the Nix package manager and NixOS, the system. And when when you read anything about reproducibility in the NixOS world, it's important to understand that that's a different definition of reproducibility that we usually use in Bitcoin. Reproducibility in the Nix world means that given some package, you know exactly what its dependencies are. You know the hash of the sources, let's say, the source code, the hash of the source code itself, and how these various dependencies play together. That's all, like everything is hashed, etc. Like you could imagine like a big Merkle tree or something of dependencies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the output is, if I build the same package on two different systems, that the output of this build, like a binary, has exactly the same bytes, right? It has exactly the same dependency, it had exactly the same source, but there may be differences on these systems, for example, the current time or whatever, that makes the binaries different. There may be like a different byte at position XYZ or whatever. So that's, I think, important to understand. However, at least for the minimal NixOS system, the binaries are actually reproducible in the sense that we mean in the Bitcoin world. So that's, I think, also an important aspect. So this reproducibility allows you also to roll back, because packages have dependencies, but also your current system consists of packages which have dependencies. So you can just store what your current system is. And if you go back to a previous system, you know exactly the packages that were used to build the system. And you don't, when I say exactly, I don't mean that you know the location where these things are. I mean, you know exactly the hash of this specific package, right? So this gives you this kind of reproducibility aspect, which I think in the security context makes sense, because that way you know exactly what you are running on the system. You know exactly, you have one hash and that's your system basically. And from that hash, you know exactly how your system is set up and what packages were used. So if some package is bad, you know if you're running it, if you're using it, and you know also hopefully how to get rid of it.
Also, the kind of reproducibility that Jonas mentioned allows us to make very deep changes in the operating system, but make you able to roll back from them. So I like to use as an example something I think which is unique to Nix Bitcoin probably in all operating system configurations, which is something called network namespaces. Usually on Linux, you have a local host and every service running opens a port on localhost and every other service can just talk to that. Sometimes services have authentication like macaroons or passwords, but sometimes you can also just call up the service and start talking to it. And we really didn't like that in Nix Bitcoin. So we invented something using standard Linux kernel functionality called network namespaces, which allows you to put every service into its own little box and gives you very fine-grained firewall control over which box is allowed to talk with which other box. So, for example, your Ride the Lightning or Spark wallet won't be able to talk to Electrum running on the same system. And this is something that goes really deep into the operating system, but because everything is reproducible in the way Jonas explained, you can switch back and forth from that. And one day when you want this extra complexity, you can have it enabled. And the next day, when you feel comfortable with running in localhost, with running everything in localhost, you can go back to that. And these kinds of deep changes wouldn't be possible with shell scripts.
Perhaps they are, but they're very complex. And just to be clear, I don't know much about these other node projects. From my perspective, they could also have that. I just can talk about what Nix Bitcoin is doing. And perhaps to rephrase this, what Nix Bitcoin Dev said about the network namespaces, and since we're also on the topic of security features, so what you use Nix Bitcoin, you enable Bitcoin D, C Lightning, and Spark Wallet, let's say, and Spark Wallet is like a front end for C Lightning. So, and your threat model is kind of that Spark Wallet is compromised, okay? That's a problem because Spark Wallet has access to your C Lightning node, right? So it can spend your coins. That's bad. But also bad is if Spark somehow is able to access your Bitcoin node as well. Like, let's say there's some kind of supply chain attack on Spark Wallet. It's not. It doesn't seem too unlikely that something like this happens. Then you really don't want Spark Wallet to access your Bitcoin. You don't even want Spark Wallet to see your transactions, your Bitcoin transactions. That would be a privacy leak. You also don't want Spark Wallet to even know that there is a Bitcoin D running on this system. And that's why we have this NetNS feature. What you can imagine that this is like a network on the Nix Bitcoin system itself. So you give each service a different IP address, and then we have a router and a firewall inside Nix Bitcoin that makes sure that only services that are supposed to talk to each other even see each other, right? Because they cannot just ping any arbitrary IP address. They can only ping the IP addresses they're supposed to talk to. So C Lightning has an IP address, Bitcoin has an IP address, and Spark Wallet can only ping and connect to C Lightning.
And also we use that opportunity to add an extra protection from IP address leaks, because if you have a certain option enabled, which is enabled by default, services are only allowed to connect out of their network namespace, out of their box, to the Tor router. So all connections, you can be sure from that service, will either go through Tor or not go to the internet at all.
And there's multiple options, right? I recall there's Tor, also a way through WireGuard, and then now I2P recently.
The I2P is Bitcoin specific, but what was amazing about the whole I2P feature is that enabling I2P with Bitcoin was a 4-line diff in our code, which is amazing if you think about it, that you can enable such a complex feature with just a couple line differences. It was just services.i2p.enable, which pulled something from NixOS, and then the appropriate options in Bitcoin D, and it was just able to start running immediately. And so that was something where I was, again, very happy that I was running Nix Bitcoin and that I'm developing on Nix Bitcoin, because doing something like that on Debian or whatever else would take much longer and be much more difficult to maintain.
So let's say something was compromised in Nix Bitcoin. Because of the way it's designed, do you feel that it would be easier to identify where it was and pinpoint it much faster than maybe the other potential node boxes that have taken more of a scripting approach?
I think mostly the advantage is that something that is compromised won't necessarily compromise other things that it doesn't have access to already. So in Jonas's example, a Spark Wallet vulnerability, which is very likely because it runs on Node.js, that would never affect Bitcoin D, because it's so sectioned off on multiple levels, starting from users to system D options and so on and so on. So I think maybe Jonas, you can say more to what Matt said, but in my opinion, the biggest advantage is basically flames from one service won't catch over immediately onto other services.
I mean, there are multiple threat models that we protect against, and one is that a package is compromised deep in your system, a library is compromised, and you might be since your whole system is pinned to certain dependencies, you know if you are running this bad dependency or not. And there's also the thing where Spark, the service itself, is compromised in some way and now tries to break out and really to damage to the whole system in various ways. So perhaps another security feature, it's more trivial, but I wonder in Raspberry Blitz, when I guess you also SSH into the system, do you do that as root, or how does that work? Question to Vivek or Matt.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, you do.
Okay, so in Nix Bitcoin, for example, we try to pay really good attention on having like a user that has restricted abilities, but is still able to interact with all these services, although the services themselves are separated by running under different Linux users. So that user is usually called the operator, and the operator can run all the important commands, but is not root, for example. And this is like a simple way, I guess, to get quite a bit more security from your node.
And this is the
And
whole.
this, for example, is also only possible. This additional complexity is really possible to maintain because of the way, the ease of the Nix OS approach. So yeah, it's something that the principle of least privilege, which is something, a basic security tenet that everything should only have access to what it absolutely needs, every user, every program, is a nice theory, but people usually, it breaks down when people start having to maintain such a system and all of a sudden something breaks, so they just disable the extra security feature and give more access than they need to. And with Nix Bitcoin, we do the whole thing once, we do it properly, and every change that we make to the software gets run through our automated testing suite. And if there's any issue, we the developers fix it before it ever gets to the users, and we know that what we are testing is exactly what is going to arrive at the user. So we talk about security often in an abstract way, but here it's very clear how the way NixOS works helps us to maintain and to create and maintain a secure system.
Nix Bitcoin Dev, since Vivek asked, can you go into the sudo versus doas story?
Oh yeah, exactly. I forgot that. So the sudo doas story was something that was also personal to me, because halfway through developing Nix Bitcoin, I stumbled upon OpenBSD, which is kind of the OG operating system for security conscious people, especially on servers. And I started to think about maybe this effort we put into developing Nix Bitcoin is misplaced. Maybe we should do OpenBSD minus Bitcoin. But I quickly discovered that just because a system is relatively secure when you boot it up doesn't mean it stays secure over time, and doesn't mean that you can respond to security vulnerabilities quickly. And one of those security vulnerabilities that popped up was the sudo bug, which first of all is because sudo is written in C, and sudo is an extremely complex program, unnecessarily so. And it was only a question of time until such a terrible security vulnerability popped up, which basically allowed any user to gain root on a system where sudo was installed. So from my background with OpenBSD, I knew that they do a couple things right, which is write really minimal good programs, like for example OpenSSH, which is in use everywhere in the industry and is the only thing I would feel comfortable running internet facing, which gives people root access to my server because it's so well reviewed and so well secured. The same authors that wrote OpenSSH also wrote a tool called doas, which has since been ported to Linux, and we decided as a project to from now on use doas as our tool to allow users to gain root access when they need to. In our system, it's more used for root to become user, but that's going into detail. The main point here is that doas is a much more minimal alternative to sudo, and changing that in NixOS again, because it's so transparent and it's code. It's not an abstract system where you input lines into a command line every couple weeks and you forget what you did before. It's a clearly laid out code which gets reviewed on GitHub by multiple people on every change. And doas making that switch was very simple. And we still, by the way, enable people to continue using sudo. It's just that we try to lean towards security in our default.
So, I mean, we have 2 comments in the chat, and I just want to make sure that I didn't speak incorrectly. With Raspberry Blitz, you use an admin user, but it has sudo access, which to me, that means it's root, right?
SSH. Is it password protected?
Yeah.
Yes, but it's always password protected, isn't it? Like you type in, so usually when you're using Linux, right, and you want to have root access, you type in sudo and then whatever command you're going to do. And then once you do that, it asks for a password and then you have root access, right?
Well, I mean, I guess there's a difference between the admin versus the root, but I don't know necessarily where their privileges end on whatever OS.
So there is a difference.
There is definitely a difference, because by us, the operator user has no way of gaining new privileges. He doesn't have access to doas in that way where he can go up to root. So I guess that's a slight difference, but I'm glad to hear that this security step is existent. Unlike Jonas, I'm not so diplomatic, and I will say that something like Umbrel, for example, has terrible security practices. And yeah, so I'm very happy to hear that Raspberry Blitz has that in place.
Nice.
Perhaps just to clarify again, we use this doas thing and also like as a replacement for sudo, and mainly for the operator user to become the C Lightning user or the Bitcoin user, and it's not possible to get root.
Gotcha.
And then Saturnity also just added Ronin Dojo has SSH key auth, so or offers it. But
any person with half a brain should be using SSH key auth. Passwords are not 2021.
Well, Matt, do you think we could jump into maybe like cool features about Nix Bitcoin? You know, they recently had a release. There's a bunch of stuff on there that I'm fascinated with. I think it's a good.
Yes, let's rip it.
Cool. So I guess the stuff that intrigues me most about Nix Bitcoin is that it's kind of agnostic. You know, there's a liquid node on there that you can enable through the module. You can have LND node. You can have a C Lightning node. There's pool on there. So I you know, frankly, in these times where there is like all sorts of protocol standardization, sharp elbows going on, I find this as like the way forward in a sense. The other things that I'm fascinated with is they also have Join Market, ElectRS, BTC Pay Server. So I wanted to give Jonas and Nix Bitcoin to have a chance to talk about maybe what they use or find cool. And then I think Saturnity had a question a while back about BTC Pay Server and LNURL, which we can jump into afterwards. But yeah, Jonas.
Definitely. So first of all, because you said C Lightning and LND and Nix Bitcoin being agnostic, I think Nix Bitcoin is probably the only node project that allows you to run C Lightning and LND at the same time easily.
I believe Raspberry Blitz just added that, but
okay.
Yeah, Nix
Great.
was the first.
So it's actually very simple, but I get very fascinated by this. But for some of the development nodes, I actually have that running, which makes it easy because I can test both on one node. But you mentioned join market, and I like using that, and it's really difficult to maintain because it's Python code, and a lot of work goes into this join market thing. So I hope I'm not the only user. But
you're the only maker making those fidelity bonds.
yeah, no comment. But join market is something I like to use. I like to use C Lightning and LND. I haven't gotten into really the Lightning stuff like pool and loop, but I love this thing called CL Boss, which Jonas turned us on to. It's the coolest thing ever. You have a C Lightning node, you put funds on it, you enable CL Boss, and it has such complex logic that it just figures out what are the best possible routes and channels for you, and just does with your funds really everything automatically and tests stuff periodically, chain rebalances, and even it even uses low fee times to do a lot of these on-chain operations. So it's something like set and forget, and you always root. You always have a root, and that's something I really like to use. And on our
even sets your channel fees.
Yeah, exactly. It's so cool.
It's so just to clarify for the freaks, this is a C Lightning plugin that I believe Z-Man made, and this isn't the first time I've heard this, and I keep hearing it from different people. You know, Francis from Bull Bitcoin, you know, he was a pessimist about Lightning, then he got intrigued by it, then he had some liquidity issues, and then he tweeted later about CL Boss fixing all of it. So very bullish on this particular plugin.
It fixed my issues too, really, and it somehow picks nodes I like. it picks cool nodes, and something else with nixbitcoin.org, because somebody mentioned BTC Pay Server. We have that running in a professional way. So if anybody wants to see how to deploy BTC Pay Server public facing, and have it really be very stable and reliable, go check out the nixbitcoin.org repo. And we have Bitcoin enabled, we have Lightning enabled, and the coolest thing is we also have Liquid enabled. So you could make liquid payments to us, which so far one person has done, but I'm really into it. What else?
Well,
I'll get done quick.
You got the only Liquid user to donate, so that's good.
Yeah.
Shots fired, man.
So
it's hard for us.
Last thing I like to use is a Spark wallet, but I think that's on the way out because it's unmaintained, and we're gonna today I finished the Lightning module, which is gonna go through very intensive testing, and then we're gonna have that as a graphical user interface for making payments with either LND or C Lightning, and also managing your node. So
the RTL package or module is going to be awesome, because I remember you guys didn't like GUI people, and we were somewhat of peasants in your eyes, but it's glad I'm very glad to know that we matter now.
No, you do, and look, it's one thing if you have a node with a couple $1,000 worth of Bitcoin on it. I'm sorry, I still use the dollar as a unit of account. I know I'm not a great toxic maximalist, but still, so if you have a node with a couple $1,000 on it, I would feel comfortable to have a GUI. But once you start getting into the tens and hundreds of thousands, I would stick with C Lightning only or LND only.
That's a fair point. The question specifically that Trinity asked were, are there plans for Nix Bitcoin to make it easy to expose a BTC Pay server to the outside world to take advantage of the new LNURL/Lightning address functionality in a safe and secure way?
So I don't know if it's so easy, but public facing again, usually we only work with Onion services in the Nix Bitcoin repo itself, and kind of say that if you want to do anything more complex, we want you to know what you're doing, and you should be doing that because Nix Bitcoin is super extensible. You should be extending that yourself. And if you want an example for how we extended Nix Bitcoin to work with ClearNet and ClearNet and Tor at the same time for nixbitcoin.org, check out the nixbitcoin.org repo. And as far as LNURL goes, we are working on that. Eric Arstead thinks that's a super cool feature, and I'm sure there'll be a very thorough and good PR coming up very soon. So Jonas, I took up a lot of time about the features, but I'm also interested to hear how you use Nix Bitcoin.
That was a good summary. I'm also a fan of CL Boss. I think more people should look into it. It's also kind of extensible, and not many people are really looking at this right now, and C-Man is only updating it from time to time. So I think this could be improved quite a bit.
What is it written in? What language?
It's in C++.
Oh, C++. Got it. Okay.
So just because I need to answer this question so I don't forget. Someone asked, how do you get a Nix white belt? And you usually get a white belt by showing up at the gym. So in this case, it would be to check out the Nix Bitcoin repository and read what is there, and perhaps also delve into the NixOS documentation.
The white belt whole stuff reminds me that I just want to say something quickly about the project culture at Nix Bitcoin, which is very software oriented in the terms of cypherpunks write code. And I know that other projects have some kind of belt system and community managers and everything. And you can rest assured that the 3 spare time Nix Bitcoin developers waste no time on such stuff and focus all their time on improving the software for your node.
And you guys are politically agnostic, right? Like, I'm a California communist, so I'm very happy that I'm embraced in your community.
So I guess we all have kind of our own political opinions, some stronger, some less strong, but we try to keep Nix Bitcoin, or we do keep Nix Bitcoin, and also a reason why I picked a NIM and a project-specific NIM. I think also the other developers are in this to write good code, and good code automatically produces freedom, I think. At least, yeah. So we're not in it to fight with anybody. We're in it to make good software, and beautiful software, non-spaghetti software, and we kind of keep our political opinions to other parts of the world.
No segue to X.
That's not political. That's technical, I think. But definitely no to X. We also had a discussion. Remember, Jonas, when Taproot stuff came up, and we took a very clear line and decided a little bit for our users. I guess something that we decide the defaults, and we definitely take a blockstream position on things. No, Jonas?
But I mean, compared to other projects, if like in the future, and this was a conversation, so I had pretty much all the other maintainers, all the other node project maintainers on for like a roundtable discussion, except for Umbrel, who refused to participate. And, one of the main that was around when the whole Taproot thing was going on with speedy trial and whatnot. And so in the future, I mean, there could be a situation where we have, contentious clients, where we have multiple clients, and, Taproot was kind of obvious. But where we have a situation where we have, multiple clients that are in contention with each other, and these node projects, are kind of going to, there's no clear answer there on how they will proceed in that type of situation. And people can say one thing or say the other, but like when push comes to shove, we'll see how that all plays out. But am I correct in my understanding that with something like Nix Bitcoin, it would be easier for me to basically choose which Bitcoin D client I'm running?
I'm not necessarily. I think that because it's kind of something where we take a lot of the technical complexity out of your hands. We also make decisions that we think are in the best interest. But I think if something really contentious came up where we wouldn't see a clear answer, where most of the time I think with Bitcoin, because it's so hard to make changes, if there are changes, they're very clear for the better, or only with pretty much only upsides. But yeah, if there was something really contentious where you could fall on either side, I think we would make an easy option for people to choose. But going in the idea of us trying to protect our users and also ourselves because we use it ourselves, we make sensible default decisions on a technical level. And also one quick thing about Vivek, I think you said you're a California communist, or who said you?
Yes, yes.
No, I think that's something also very important by us, that we accept and love and accept everybody, I guess. But definitely everybody's welcome, and it's about running good code and using Bitcoin the way it's supposed to be used, on sovereign hardware, privacy by default, security by default, and not about anything else. And
But am I
wrong?
Am I wrong in that like to run a different version of Bitcoin, all I have to do is change a line item in the config file?
Jonas, what do you think? I mean, these are future things.
I mean, if it's contentious, then it's already too late. So there's no safe option. Yes, then we would have some option. I mean, would make it optional to the user. But probably other node projects would make similar choices and would make it easy for the user, whether that's like changing a config file or changing something in the GUI, I guess.
So a couple of things here. First off, being facetious about the whole California communist thing, skills are what matters most. So I echo Nick's Bitcoin dev sentiments. It seems like specifically for this instance of Taproot speedy trial, Nick's Bitcoin is not as inclined to take the lot true approach, maybe rightfully so. Given that UASF did reveal that the full nodes are like the validators in the network, and the miners are kind of the appenders who need to follow the full nodes say, of course, with contention of economic nodes and all the other variables thrown into the mix. But with that said, there was no reason to drive things to that right away. If it was, contentious in that sense where miners were adversarial, then of course we can do it. But in this specific instance, it didn't feel as if that was the right way to do things and further set precedent. Not to say that's not a valid opinion. I do very much respect Luke Dasher as well as others that would run the code and have expressed that opinion, like MBK, So I think it varies. And if it did come down to that contentious moment again, like UASF, I think like there would be like multiple, I guess, configs for this, and maybe all the distributions or node boxes of whatever client software.
The whole lot true thing also goes with our general philosophy, which is safety, stability first, and we like to do things easy and not, go all the way all of a sudden. We're very thoughtful in our decisions. Everything in our code base has a lot of thought that goes into it. And once we fix one thing, it stays like that and we like it, it stays like that forever. So we are very careful usually with our code and also with these kinds of things. And so I think that gives a little bit of the background why we didn't choose to go with the radical approach initially.
Another thing
this is people's money, it's people's Bitcoin, and once it's gone, it's never coming back. So,
no, I mean, I appreciate the conservative nature for sure. I think most Bitcoiners do. It's like become part of our ethos in general. Another line of conversation that came from that conversation was the ability to like easily migrate between node projects. If, let's say, you're running an Umbrella or a Raspberry Blitz and they decide to go a route that you don't want them to go and you want to easily migrate without closing out all your channels. Is that something you guys have considered? Is it like how difficult is the migration process if someone already has a if they're already running Raspberry Blitz and they have a bunch of channels open, or vice versa, if they're running Nix Bitcoin and they have a bunch of channels open and they want to move to Raspberry Blitz? Is that something that you guys have considered?
So I guess in theory, more than even a Nix Bitcoin question, this is, I guess, how easily can you port your channel DB and wallet.dat and actually like the different derivation standards, like the AZ with the birthday and other stuff. Would you say that's fair, Jonas? And how does Nix Bitcoin do this? And maybe whether it's different or similar to others?
I think this is quite difficult to do in a general way. I know people who did this, who didn't lose their funds, but I think there are many things that can go wrong. Just imagine that like the LND or C Lightning versions are different on the Nix Bitcoin node you're porting to the node you're porting from, and somehow your data directory isn't compatible anymore and it expects something else somewhere else. So I think that gets difficult really quickly. I think it's a good question because could be expensive to close your channels to set up a node. I'm in principle, if you had two Nix Bitcoin or NixOS based projects, I guess it would be simpler to make this switch, because then you could do it basically programmatically, because you know what versions are running there. But for like to migrate from a general, like any kind of Bitcoin node, I guess that requires some custom thinking.
So, Jonas, you just made a PR that I'm going to review in the next days of the backup plugin for C Lightning. Wouldn't you just be able to restore from your backups from one C Lightning backup you made to your new Nix Bitcoin node, or vice versa?
I guess that's kind of what I was alluding to in the clarifications for this question. Are we talking like between implementations, because that might be more of a Lightning problem, or are we talking between like nodes? And then also essentially don't want to dox a person, but we did necessarily see someone who's able to migrate from LND recently, correct? In our Elements chat.
I guess if it's about changing between different Lightning implementations, of course, that's not our problem. But yeah, I guess it's too easy to lose funds. And to Nix Bitcoin Dev's question, we have this backup plugin. Actually, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure what the backup plugin does. It simply writes down the SQL statements that would usually go to your database. And it writes simply the SQL statements into a file appended. And I'm not sure how portable it is between versions, but that's a really good question.
We need to figure this kind of stuff out, because I have this dream. I have articulated it in some private conversations, but my kind of long-term vision, which is just mine, and not, as Jonas pointed out in the very beginning, very clearly, I'm not the lead maintainer, but my vision is to. We have a couple things that we really need to get done, which is one, ride the Lightning, and really good backups solutions, and a couple of other things. And after we finish those things, I want to make a v0.1 or 1.0, whatever, in our naming scheme release. And from that point on, just make functional improvements or deprecate one feature in favor of another, but not keep expanding the complexity of Nix Bitcoin, adding new features, but instead make that more part of secondary projects for people's private like module extensions. But I kind of want to make a finish line for Nix Bitcoin and start only making improvements in functionality and then in speed, secure, all these kinds of underlying stuff, which we pride ourselves in. I think we want to get better and better in that. And backups is one thing that is, I think, a question for all of Lightning, but specifically for us because we want to be the most safe and conservative node for people. And a good backup strategy is an integral part of that. So I want to get into that in the coming. That's one of the most highest priority things that we want to get done, also for our own interest, not just because we think it's a good idea, but I also would appreciate having clarity about how safe my Lightning funds are in case of hardware failure. And because Vivek mentioned Matrix and our Element chat, I want to give a quick plug that I think that Bitcoin users should slowly migrate onto Matrix, which is shaping up to be a very robust, decentralized, federated chat solution. And I think this is more in the ethos of Bitcoin than people using centralized things like even Keybase or whatever, which can all have a political lean. And it's just a matter of time until people start getting banned, until people start getting shadow banned, whatever. So I think that quick thing just about Matrix and our project is pro Matrix. We have a Matrix server which also interacts with IRC over libera.chat, and we're really, I feel very comfortable with this, and I think every Bitcoiner should have his own square, his own little house in the digital realm, his own property. Like he has his money, he should also have property over his communications. Just a side note, and we'll get back on topic.
Hey Matt, my autism is kicking in because of this beer, but I wanted to dive even deeper, like for backups, essentially. With the channel DB, you know, the main issue is like the state and like storing all those revocation points or the transactions, right, Jonas? And like with the commitments, does any prove out? Will that reduce the amount of state required and reduce like the channel DB size?
In principle, yes. You should only have to store the latest state. And if you store an earlier state because you have an older backup, an updated backup, essentially, instead of losing your funds, you should be able to recover trustlessly, kind of modulo fees with your channel partner.
Awesome.
But before we move away from this whole feature discussion, I want to answer a few questions from the chat. So let me find this. Radix Rat asked if I want a new version of Bitcoin Core that's not supported yet via the Nix Bitcoin update scripts, what should I do? That's a good question. So I can tell you that if I wanted to do that, that would take me 2 minutes or something to do that. But for someone who hasn't worked with Nix, it would easily take a couple of hours. And the reason is just that we have to be honest, the Nix and NixOS documentation is really terrible, and it's a lot of custom things that need to be done. I could show you easily in 2 minutes how to do it if you show up in our Matrix channel, for example. I guess that would be the right answer to this question. But usually we try to update relatively quickly. I think our Bitcoin D updates, they landed within 2 weeks, 1 or 2 weeks within the release.
Yeah, something that also, I think that on top of the security features and everything, Nix Bitcoin is one of the node projects I think that updates the quickest, and you don't have to wait on stuff with us. We usually have things running in days or or maximum one, crazy times 2 weeks, but usually we're snappy with maintaining stuff, except join market, which usually takes a long time to figure out how to do.
And just to clarify my earlier point, using Nix Bitcoin the way it's intended to be used should be relatively straightforward for a technical user who's familiar with command line. But if you want to do custom stuff, then it gets quite difficult quickly. And that's why we say it's the lowest time preference node project, because it makes sense to invest into learning these things, because then in the long run, you hopefully have fewer problems.
So Jonas, I read in the chat a lot of stuff about making it easier for noob users or not so technical people. I even read the dirty word Windows and other things. So what do you think about us making Nix Bitcoin pleb friendly and lowering the bar of entry?
Can I take this?
Yes.
So, I mean, I've been telling Jonas for a while that I'm going to build a tutorial. Matt had like the PlebNet folks on before, Rajwinder and P. Many others I've discussed with, also like another guy named Richard, Miguel, Rafael. So they are interested in this, and they are fairly technical. So I think it's very much possible as long as there's like a good tutorial. So working on that with some Intel NUC hardware that Jonas has suggested. Specifically to the Windows question you mentioned, is from VidGamer14. He says, the bar to entry seems extremely high. Like, can you even run this on an old Windows laptop? And to that, I say, I have run Nix OS on an old MacBook Pro from 2010, and it worked. I got Nix Bitcoin running as well. I tried recently on a 2017 Surface Pro. What's it called? The resolution was a little screwed up, but if I plugged in an HDMI, I was able to see a font on another monitor. And I think for the most part, Nix does run pretty well on multiple things. But the main issue I've encountered is whether, to use the UEFI booting or I guess the legacy BIOS boot option, like in the Nix OS install instructions. But once again, like Jonas and Nix Bitcoin Dev mentioned, just hop in the Matrix and ask some questions, and people are more than willing to help you.
Matrix or Libera.chat if you're into IRC more. Maybe we bridge out to other things in the future, but right now that's really what we use for communication. I read 2 questions here that are related from Setrinity and Sovereign Hodler. Can you talk more about the BTC Pay Server implementation and how you're exposing it to the outside world? Does Nix Bitcoin use Tor? Great question. So first of all, Nix Bitcoin by default always uses Tor and only Tor. So if you are running on a home node and you want to start up a BTC Pay Server, if you go into the config and uncomment the line BTC Pay Server enable, what will happen is that once you deploy that to a node, it will set everything up and generate a Tor Onion service for your use. Once you want to leave the Tor world, and once you want to endanger your own privacy and start dealing with NAT and all those things, you're kind of on your own, which I think is something we want to make a little bit difficult. But I wouldn't recommend it for home use, especially exposing your IP address and dealing with NAT. Usually better if you want to have a BTC Pay Server just for interacting with people privately, just to use Tor. And if you want to know, then Sovereign Hodler, can you elaborate on public-facing BTC Pay? Does it expose your home IP? No. Public-facing with an Onion service won't. And if you start going out of that secure space, like we did with nixbitcoin.org, it does expose your IP, obviously, because you're using ClearNet. And that's something we did manually there.
Are you aware of the IP2 Tor support that Raspberry Blitz has integrated?
I am aware, but of its name, but I never. How does it
So
make
the
it ClearNet IP?
the name is like pretty self-explanatory. So like the issue is, right, so like if you're a merchant and you want to run BTC Pay Server and you want to run on your own hardware, doing Onion only, doing Tor only is kind of a non-starter. Like all your customers need to, open up Tor browser and go to your Onion link. They can't
Depends
access
what
the
kind of
Tor
merchant
link.
you are.
That's true. It depends on the type of merchant you are. But if you're just like a standard,
I'm selling coffee.
yeah, you're selling coffee and you want to use BTC Pay Server, it's pretty much a non-starter to do Tor only. But the other issue is that if you're running it at home or you're running it out of your office, exposing your IP to the whole world is obviously horrible for your privacy and security. So they have this IP to Tor service integrated where you pay them sats and it basically does a tunnel through Tor to a VPS that they run, and then they provide you like a ClearNet IP. So you
That
can.
sounds a little centralized to me.
Yeah, it's extremely centralized and it's not very reliable, to be honest, but it's a cool feature. I've kind of come to the conclusion, and I'm curious of your opinion, is like if you're a merchant in that kind of situation, I mean, the perfect example is my other podcast, Rabbit Hole Recap, where we accept donations via BTC Pay Server, is to just run a dedicated BTC Pay Server instance on some server somewhere that's, virtual private server, and you just expose that IP address and you keep it contained and you just have a separate node for yourself. Right.
And then you would take a look at nixbitcoin.org or at how we did it there, and that gives you a pretty straightforward way to also expose BTC Pay Server publicly and also safely. Because what we did with our nixbitcoin.org is that in Nginx, in the web server, we disallow access to a lot of the admin API and API admin stuff that people don't need publicly, which I think is a mistake in BTC Pay Server, kind of that the same way you administrate the node is also the way you access it as a customer. We have certain issues with BTC Pay Server, but not to get into it. We block all that stuff, so I think it's really worthwhile to take a look there, but probably something we should make easier in the future. But as far as how I would do it if I was a merchant, trying to not expose my public IP address, but at the same time be available over ClearNet with high reliability, is I would use WireGuard to run a very simple public VPS server, or something that really only takes one CPU core and maybe half a gigabyte of memory to have a public facing WireGuard server that tunnels from that public IP address to your local machine. But I think that's something that's that's something that isn't straightforward as just setting an option in Nix Bitcoin. So Jonas, do you think that's something that is in the project's future to make easier, or are we sticking with Tor only?
To be honest, it should not be too difficult to set this up yourself. I've done that a couple of times. There are probably ways for Nix Bitcoin to make this simpler for you to use. Perhaps one thing to mention is that if you can use NixOS on one machine and deploy your configuration to one machine, but you could also run your whole infrastructure on NixOS, which means that you have one configuration file per server and you can deploy them all with one command, and they can interact with each other, share their variables, etc. And once you're doing that, you're definitely not a pleb anymore. So if pleb means anything, you're not a pleb anymore. So I thought about this a lot today. Like, if you're doing that, you're not a pleb. So people should be aware of that.
You're not a pleb, you're a freak now. Yeah, freaks.
But Jonas, how would you go about it? Would you put the BTC Pay server on a VPS and have it connect to your Bitcoin node over WireGuard, or would you put the BTC Pay server on your own hardware and just put the public facing WireGuard server on a VPS?
I guess that depends on your situation and how powerful your VPS is. For example, sometimes these VPSs that you can get privately are pretty underpowered, so perhaps you only want to run BTC Pay server there, especially if it should be performant. So it all depends, and this is really like if we want to add support for it in Nix Bitcoin, then the question is exactly in what way, because people are different and have different requirements. And that's why it makes sense to learn how to use NixOS, because then you can build these systems by yourself relatively easily. But I think something like IP2Tor is pretty elegant solution to this problem.
What I think that what's different also about Raspberry Blitz and Nix Bitcoin, which is a disadvantage and an advantage at the same time for Raspberry Blitz, is that Raspberry Blitz thinks about a very specific kind of user and makes it easy for that guy. So it thinks about a user who has a Raspberry Pi 4 with this and this amount of gigabytes and this kind of HD or SSD, and who's running it at home and wants to do things that somebody at home does. But what Nix Bitcoin takes more the root is that we give a basic kind of function and some really streamlined stuff. And once you want to do something more, you start extending it yourself, which is much easier than you think probably. And once more people start using it and sharing their configurations and writing tutorials, it will become as easy as just following a tutorial for your use case. I'm not sure if those are things that we should really determine for people in Nix Bitcoin, because Nix Bitcoin tries to take the agnostic approach and not presume a way you're using it.
Yeah, I think just one aspect of that, I'd be in favor of removing features from Nix Bitcoin, actually. Make it as simple as possible, but extensible. So that's one of the things that we're investing quite a bit of time on. How can we make Nix Bitcoin extensible? So we have one core Nix Bitcoin system that perhaps has Bitcoin D and perhaps the Lightning implementation and sidechains or whatever, has a module for having a Tor interface and the password interface, but everything else would be kind of separate repositories that can have a separate governance and would be able to easily integrate with this Nix with the like upstream Nix Bitcoin system.
Yeah, and also for, if anything, once we reach that certain point where we have more features, these couple of features that we've laid out that we need, like a graphical node manager and other stuff, we're not going to keep on adding to Nix Bitcoin, but we're going to start chiseling away at it and making it more robust. And yeah.
I mean, this kind of already works. So people are using Nix Bitcoin and build modules on top of that without integrating them into the upstream Nix Bitcoin repo. I'm not sure if I'm not going to dox him who's doing that anyway. So it's already possible, but it's just not very ergonomic at the moment and not documented at all.
If anybody still has a burning question, I would suggest reposting it again, because I'm reading through questions now and I'm not sure what really got answered in the context. So somebody's still listening and hasn't had their question properly answered, please write it again, maybe if you can, because
I think
scrolling through is.
yeah.
I saw it wasn't a question, but Winsome Hacks was saying, he was commenting on my question, which was the twofold question, which was migration and the ability to choose which Bitcoin version you run. And he was saying, I think rightfully so, that it's important that we have standardization and these things are easier to use rather than focusing on edge cases. The reason I brought it up is because to me, to my monkey brain over here, I see we never had like these node projects before, right? Like this is like a relatively new phenomenon. If you've been in Bitcoin for a while, we used to just, run Bitcoin D or run Bitcoin Core. Now you have all these like managed node projects. And one of the things like Umbrel has been making noise about lately is whether the validity of their claim is correct or not. They're taking credit for a lot of the growth on Lightning and a lot of the growth in node count and saying that it's their users that are running these nodes. So in my mind, I immediately go to this theoretical situation in the future where whatever the leading node project is decides to, push their users towards some kind of contentious
It's
version of
basically
Bitcoin. So I think that's like a real fear. Like I think that's something that could happen in the future. And I'd prefer if we weren't trying to figure it out, as it was going down.
I mean, Matt, like you're spot on. Like this is basically like a redo of or deja vu of BitPay and like
Yeah.
just noobs, and I think this problem will always be there where the noob users will come into like whatever, like a MyNode or an Umbrel, and then they'll brag about having like onboarding 9 of 10 nodes of like the last year. But I think it's our duty to make sure like they go further down the funnel, right? Like maybe like they just get pissed off because like their channel state just keeps crashing, and then it just corrupts. Other things like maybe they get jacked because there's just too much attack surface. Things like that. Like I think no matter what, it'll be whack-a-mole with whatever is at the top of that funnel, and
So-
it's pretty fucked.
So I guess that also with node projects, now that you're adding that layer of abstraction, you also have to kind of find who you align with philosophically. And I'm somewhat skeptical that Nix Bitcoin is going to become, by itself, Nix Bitcoin is going to become the go-to Bitcoin node for everybody. Maybe as an underlying structure for a more user-focused, more user-friendly thing built on top. But by itself, I don't see Nix Bitcoin going that route of being the mainstream node project, I guess. But it's something for people who align with our philosophy of conservatism, stability, security, and taking things into your own hand a little bit, technically also to be sovereign in that way, which I think is you don't have the option as somebody who wants to remain sovereign digitally of being a tech noob. You need to increase your skills over time because the other side is also increasing their skills and building a more and more elaborate net of control over companies and whatever. So when you really want to be sovereign, you need to also kind of understand the technological side. And if you align with our philosophy of conservatism and security first, then it's worth investing the effort. And probably it's not going to be everybody, but we're going to be that role in the market.
100%. I guess not to beat a dead horse, but just reframe my perspective a little bit. I tend to agree with you that, and with Vivek, that Nix Bitcoin will be, and should be, I think rightfully so, geared to more technical users who are farther down the funnel. I guess my perspective is, and maybe this is just like maybe this isn't even on the dev side. Maybe this is more on like a tutorial side, but to make it easier for people to migrate from these top of the funnel node projects down to Nix Bitcoin, because right now, I mean, I have pie on my face from earlier in this year when I was calling for a sustained high fee market. And as you can see from mempool.space being streamed right now, fees have been fucking low as hell. But in a sustained high fee environment, all of a sudden, all those lightning channels you have open become real frictions, sticking points where people, might not like the direction a node project's going, but they're hesitant to move because they have to close and then open. So each channel is 2 on-chain transactions. So it's just, I think it's just something to consider, making it easier for someone who's already on one of the other node projects to migrate over to Nix. But maybe, yeah.
I think you're hitting a couple things that are super interesting. I think Start9 is well positioned to be probably like the most compelling top of the funnel solution that has a multitude of these sort of offerings. Ideally, they have some other competitors that are a bit more respectable, not just Umbro. And then with that then said, you highlighted on a great point of vendor lock-in, not only between like the node boxes, but maybe between the Lightning implementations themselves, and I don't necessarily know if like we fix that, it's more of like on a standardization or like a spec level type of thing that needs to be ironed out about like the backups and channel DB, like it gets hairy really fast.
I totally agree that standardization would be nice. Absolutely. I don't exactly see the lock-in problem. It would be a problem if it was a problem. But for example, in Raspberry Blitz, if they would make decisions you don't agree with, at least if it's like a simple thing using Bitcoin Core version X versus version Y, someone could fork it and hopefully you'd be able to intercept the update process and basically point to this forked repository instead of the original one. At least with Nix Bitcoin, that would be possible. And it should be possible because otherwise you're not in control of your money.
Yeah. I guess that's where
that's a good point.
That's where some of the node boxes, rightfully so, have diverging opinions about open source and like FOSS.
Oh yeah, that's something very important, that free software isn't just something that you throw around because it's a cool marketing term, but it's a way of thinking about the world, that your computer is your property, an extension of your brain and you, and free software means being in control of that. And Nix Bitcoin takes the maximum approach on that, and we're MIT licensed. Somebody also, I think I read in the chat that it needs to be a business, and businesses are. Nix Bitcoin is first and foremost a free software project that people develop in their free time. People who don't have economic interests except that they want to have a great node that works really well. And there's a place in the market for that too. There isn't just a place in the market for glossy quote unquote open source available nodes. There's also a place in the market for a hardcore MIT project, hobbyist, made with love, made carefully, made for your own use project, and that's Nix Bitcoin.
And not to really, toot our horn or whatever, but this is like priceless. It's not to say like this needs a business or whatever. Like literally, I have Jonas Nick, one of the Taproot BIP authors, working on this as like his pet project. So it's something fascinating.
And you have also Eric, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on the inner workings of Nix, reviewing every PR meticulously. And also, not to toot my own horn, but I'm more on the paranoid side of things, as Jonas would probably confirm. and I'm also looking at things, and everything is always open for review. And there's some very technical people using it. Again, not to dox anybody, but there's people who know what they're doing, who are using Nix Bitcoin and also looking at code changes. So I think those are things that are really, as you said, priceless and not a business case.
Hey, Matt, I had a flash of autism again. You know, when we linked up, we were talking about PTLCs and I guess Taproot in a sense of like, do channels need to close or how are they updated? We have Jonas on here with us too. So I recall just based on what you said
Yeah,
about
Jonas, do I have to close all my channels to take advantage of PTLCs?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
You will have to. I mean, you won't get the benefit of music, for example, immediately because your channel is already open, right? So if you want to close it, you always have to provide 2 signatures to close it. So I guess that's. But PTLC should be separate from that.
Well, so you can have like the output updated in the existing channel, right? But to take advantage of maybe the updates to Bolt 7 and 2 and 3, that's when you need to close it and reopen.
Why would you have to close and reopen?
I'm a simple pleb. This is the impression I was under.
Close and reopen for updating to music or for updating to PTLCs?
Just like I guess PTLCs, maybe Taproot address, music ideally, like whatever is like the.
There's this meme going around that like we open channels for our grandchildren, right? Like you want to have long-lasting channels that are there for years and have reputation and whatnot. But is that just a meme? Like, are we going to be constantly closing our channels and opening them up for whatever new goodies we have in line?
That's a good question. So it depends on what the upgrade is. I think the Lightning community, which I'm not really a deep part of the technical Lightning community, they would like to start with upgrading to music first, which would mean that instead of having 2 public keys and 2 signatures on the chain for an open and close of a channel, you would only have 1 public key and 1 signature. But for doing that, of course, since the public key is in the channel opening, you would have to close and reopen. But perhaps doing that can be deferred to your grandchildren, so you will always have this open channel. I think if you want to upgrade to L2, you would have to make another Bitcoin transaction. That doesn't have to be a closing transaction, but at least another Bitcoin transaction.
I just want to catch up on 2 questions I saw in the chat. If the PTLC conversation is that as a conclusion?
We can go back to that. I want to totally nerd out with Jonas later about ring signatures and other stuff.
Okay, so just quickly, I suppose Winsome Hack says, I suppose the question then is, who do you see using it? There are many more people not using it than using it and want to migrate. So I really see the technical users who are focused on Nix using it at the moment. And I think that because we're so focused on improving stuff right now, I don't think we even have the time of doing tutorials. And so if anybody here listening is a good project, always needs somebody who's into documentation and somebody who's making videos and showing people how to migrate and all this stuff. So I think our project would very much benefit from you if you're like that. But until that really happens and gets easier, I really see the technical people using it or people within companies who want a good basis to build on, just using Nix Bitcoin as their starting point. Another question that I saw also, Winston
just to that question, how
Yeah.
to contribute. I think another way to contribute is just to suggest what we should do with Nix Bitcoin, because perhaps there was this impression earlier that we are kind of building Nix Bitcoin for some ideal Bitcoin user, but that's not the case, at least not for me. Whatever I do mostly for myself. I do stuff that I want to use myself. So sometimes it's difficult to know what is currently on vogue in the Bitcoin world, like whatever a Lightning node manager or something like that. So I'm always happy to get suggestions in that area.
That again, that's nice about Nix, and I guess free software in general, that the knowledge and the use cases of different people can come together in a homogeneous project. And that's, we share all of the knowledge, we share the use cases, and the more people who put in the effort to get into Nix Bitcoin, the better it's going to become. And another thing that I really want to get into with Nix Bitcoin is exploring the different ways that Nix OS has, or in the Nix OS community, of verifying packages in the way that reproducibility is understood in the Bitcoin world. I think that's something we really need to do, Jonas. And we talked about originally, there was something, Trustix, that came up, that basically packages get built on a decentralized network of servers controlled by different people, and then hashes of the final binaries get compared, and then only the ones where they truly are the same for everybody get put into the system for users to download from. And we really need to exploit more the reproducibility in the sense of Bitcoin nature of Nix OS.
I think that's another point that's worth getting into. So you were talking about like you do a Nix Bitcoin upgrade and perhaps your Bitcoin D version upgrades, and usually you would go to the Nix OS cache and download the new Bitcoin D version. But that's of course a problem if you do that, and the cache that is maintained by the Nix OS people is compromised and would provide a backdoored Bitcoin D. So what we're actually suggesting in the tutorial is to build everything yourself. So then when you do a Nix Bitcoin upgrade, it actually takes a while. For me, on my system, usually it depends, sometimes half a day or so. But during that time, the whole system, everything that changed, is rebuilt from source. And I think that's also a really great security feature.
And you can also have something which I have is in my network, a build server, where every Nix OS computer, every Nix OS machine running in my network hands off all the intensive build tasks to the build server, which has a lot of cores, high memory. It's obviously not something that everybody can use, but if you're going the maximum security way, want to build everything from source and don't want to wait half a day, that's something you should look into. Jonas, that was just,
Yep.
I quickly, continue, please. I just quickly wanted to, so not everybody thinks that it's, the only option is waiting half a day. You have the option of going.
But if you do that,
again,
you're not a pleb anymore. You're like
Yeah.
Saruman in his tower commanding his Urukai.
Saruman in his watchtower. Yep.
Okay, I think before, so there are at least three points on Nix Bitcoin that I would like to make before we go on to this other nerd discussion. So one is that a security feature that we haven't mentioned yet are, which I think are underappreciated, are Bitcoin D RPC white lists. So what that is, that's a list that a Bitcoin D RPC user is allowed to, it's a list of RPC commands that a Bitcoin D RPC user is allowed to make. So you could have a public Bitcoin RPC user, which we're doing in Nix Bitcoin, and that public user only has read access to your Bitcoin D node. So the whitelist would say, yeah, you can read blocks, or you can check what the chain tip is, or you can see the peers, but you cannot use send to address, or you cannot interact with the wallet at all because the RPC command is not allowed to be used. And where is this useful? For example, it's useful if C Lightning is compromised, because usually C Lightning has full access, has RPC access to Bitcoin D. So a compromised C Lightning could easily just spend all the coins in the Bitcoin wallet as well, which is something that, of course, you want to prevent. But if you use these whitelists, which we do by default in Nix Bitcoin, then even a compromised C Lightning cannot steal your coins on Bitcoin D because it uses these whitelists. So everyone who's running their own Bitcoin node should think about this and integrate it or switch to Nix Bitcoin to make use of Bitcoin D RPC whitelists.
We also do the same thing with macaroons. So for BTC Pay Server, for example, we don't just give it the admin macaroon. We bake a custom macaroon that only includes the permissions that BTC Pay Server absolutely needs for LND.
Hey, going through my point, apparently. Second one is that we have a relatively comprehensive test framework. So that means that if you open a PR, then basically a Nix Bitcoin will be spun up on a VM, and it will be checked whether all the services are running and whether they can interact with each other. And this is really useful. It's also basically a feature of NixOS. I mean, other people can reproduce it, but it works quite well. And as a result, we have relatively frequent releases because we don't really, when we do updates, we don't have to do manual testing, really, perhaps a bit. But if these tests are running, then we know basically that we can release the software. That's really nice. And also what this test framework allows you to do is to have a setup. Okay, it's like this. Some of our bug reports are scripts. They are scripts that build a Nix Bitcoin system and try to reproduce this bug. And that works similar to the VM examples that we mentioned earlier. So you run the script. It can be just a few lines, sometimes 5-6 lines. And this will spin up a VM and with all the Nix Bitcoin services, and will try to do something weird that will exercise this bug. And this is a really nice feature because it allows you to quickly figure out what the problem is and how to solve it.
That's awesome.
Okay. I think another point that Nix Bitcoin Dev made earlier was that Nix Bitcoin is for technical people, but Nix Bitcoin is also a sandbox. Nix Bitcoin is modules, NixOS modules. And if you use the tutorial to set it up, you will use our preset to, which basically says how these services interact with each other. We call this preset secure node, by the way, because it does all the Tor by default stuff, etc. But you don't have to use it that way. You can use it in any way you like if you understand NixOS. But what I think follows from that is that anyone, since Nix is also composable, anyone could try to build something more user-friendly on top. I mean, if you, let's say a graphical user interface, for example. So we have a user interface, but it's command line based. I think it's pretty good. It has versioning. It will tell you if there are incompatible changes in a new version. It will tell you what to do in such a case. But it's just a command line interface. Other people may prefer graphical user interfaces, and I think because NixOS is so composable, it's relatively easy, if you know something about NixOS, to build stuff on top that's more user-friendly.
Yeah, we had a question about that on Twitter. About you guys are never going to implement GUIs yourself, right?
There's a RTL that they're trying to merge, right?
I guess the question is if we're going to have a GUI to manage your node, and Jonas, your brother mentioned something some time ago about there was a Nix GUI thing, but I also like the command line interface, so I don't know. I'm not. I wouldn't be bullish on that.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Raspberry Blitz made the same decision.
Yeah, great. They're much better than everything I'm hearing here. Is really good stuff about Raspberry Blitz.
Bullish on Raspberry Blitz and Ronin Dojo, but man, I was gonna say these guys are clearly attack surface driven, so adding a GUI doesn't necessarily warrant the benefits.
Yeah, I feel that. It's cool that someone else could do it if they wanted to, though, very relatively easily, it sounds like.
Yep.
But what you have to also know about GUIs nowadays is that the way people develop GUIs with Electron, which sucks, or Node, which has JS, which has, we used to think that supply chain attacks are theory and never happen, but now we know they do happen, and they happen almost exclusively through NPM and the Node JS ecosystem. So GUIs seem to me, at least, to be a huge problem, and also on Linux, as long as you're not using Wayland, which is the newest kind of graphical driver behind the scenes. If you use Xserver, which is the standard on pretty much everything, you have to know that each one of your GUIs can see all other GUIs and can read all keystrokes from all other GUIs. So that's maybe something that reflects badly on Linux in general, but that's the way it works, and it's a terrible thing. It's a huge security hole, and the only way to get around that while staying in the Linux world is by using Wayland, which is really good and is already being used, I think, in Fedora and Linux Mint. I'm not sure, but definitely in Fedora, or using something like CubesOS, which goes the extreme route of running everything in its own virtual machine. But yeah, it's GUIs bring a lot of problems. They're not just good. If you want a hardcore security node, privacy node, probably it's a good decision to stay away from GUIs in general. And one off the topic thing I wanted to say before Jonas makes his third point, right, about Nix Bitcoin, is that privacy, I try to say this often, and I also want to say it here, is that privacy is not something dark. Privacy is not something illicit or criminal. Privacy is the basic way that the world used to work and should return to working, that a human being has control over who he exposes private information to and to what degree and for how long, and just really the individual being in control. And the way it works now with regulation and all these things are toothless, and we're moving into a world that's not the way it's supposed to work. And privacy is not the issue. Privacy is actually the most important thing that we're losing, and it's not something that usually in the marketing things privacy is portrayed as somebody with dark goggles and a hoodie, and it's not that. And Nix Bitcoin is not a dark project because we use Tor and privacy. It's a very bright project, a positive project, in that we give the user control over who he exposes information to. And we always make the decision towards privacy for the user, and he needs to invest effort to leave that secure space. And I think that's how it's supposed to be. If you want to start risking stuff, you should have the technical knowledge of how it works. But by default, we want to protect you as much as we can. So Jonas, please continue. Just this is something important that I want to say on every forum that I have.
Thank you for reiterating that. That's super important, and I'm kind of a broken record on the show about it. So, but the freaks can always use another reminder.
Absolutely. I actually made my 3 points already. The only thing left on my list is like what to do, where to start if you want to use Nix Bitcoin now. Should I go on with that, or do we have more discussion topics?
Where to start?
Yep.
Yeah, let's. That seems pretty important.
Okay, we've mentioned it a couple of times. We have this matrix server, so that will be a start. Just join, or if you prefer IRC, join IRC on Libera. It's pound Nix dash Bitcoin, I hope, or Nix Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
Nix minus or Nix dash Bitcoin.
Okay. Then we have this tutorial. So if you go on to github.com/fort-nix/nix-bitcoin, then you will find a README, and there's a get started section, and that brings you to a tutorial, kind of discussed what it does. But that should be a good start and should basically work if you have a target system. If you don't have a target system, then you can just run the examples. We also discussed this earlier. As long as you have the Nix package manager, that should be also easily installable, I guess, with regular package managers. Depends on your distro. But these examples, they worked on Mac OS at one point, but I don't think they work anymore, unfortunately. So for that, you would need a Linux machine. What else? I think those are the most important points, how to get started if you want to use Nix Bitcoin. Yeah, nixbitcoin.org. That's also another repository in the Fort Nix organization. And there you basically have a good example of how you could set up a system, for example, with a public BTC Pay server, etc. And yeah, lastly, if you would just want to learn more about Nix, I'm not sure if I've mentioned it earlier, there are also the so-called Nix pills. And this is a tutorial that basically explains all the advantages of Nix and also gives you an introduction into Nix as a programming language.
With the Nix pills, I've gone through them many times, and I have to say I never understood them. I went at it, I think, also like other people using Nix Bitcoin who I know of from the hacker side, where I just used it until I figured out how to use it. And that's also, if you're more that kind, then I and also another person that I know who uses Nix Bitcoin can give testimony that also works. So you don't have to have a background in computer science to with the right attitude get this thing running.
Yeah, there's levels to this game. Absolutely.
I love it.
What is Urbit?
Yeah, someone please give a definition of Urbit.
CLAR.
I've had someone try to explain it to me for like an hour and a half, and I just can't.
I just think of it as like a whole new networking stack, like with its own language and everything. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
They have like shitcoins integrated. They like call them like planets, stars, and universes. And
imagine if DNS was like a shitcoin, and they also had like a language to essentially provision different IPs and whatnot. And then
I'm scared. I'm gonna have nightmares from this. My pure Bitcoin head has never heard of this.
I'm playing, but yeah.
All the Urbit guys are gonna this tiny little mention of it, and they're all gonna flood our mentions now.
Nix Bitcoin is gonna get this. This is like the the insider alpha, right, for Citadel Dispatch. Like, there's now a Nix Bitcoin and Urbit beef. We just started just now.
One question, if anybody knows, what is Squeak Node? Because somebody opened a PR at Nix Bitcoin adding something called Squeak Node, which doesn't have a description in its repo, and I have no idea what it does. If anybody knows what it is, please tell us.
No idea.
Did you ever figure that out?
Squeak Note, I have no idea what it is. But
Hey,
the PR
Matt.
gets updated.
Matt, Bitcoin Sign Guy is still there, right? At Urbit.
Yeah, BSG is like product lead or something at Urbit.
All
So
right, there's
when I
hope.
said that I've been chilled it for like an hour and a half, it's really just him personally, and it was way longer than an hour and a half. It was like multiple times.
I'm bullish on anyone that can get in front of Janet Yellen with the buy Bitcoin sign. They'll figure it out. I guess, is this the time where now I can just like
Yeah, just you want your autism to run wild, or
yes,
you want to wrap it up?
Wait a sec. Wait a sec.
Go ahead.
Do you hear
There
that?
we go.
Yeah.
Sipping on the good stuff.
Nice. All right, I'm gonna go grab a beer too. One more.
I listened to a lot of rabbit hole recaps and wanted to do that one day. So
Wow, that means a lot. That means a lot. Just trying my best out here. I'll tell you, this conversation has been fantastic. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to trying Nix out.
Same. I learned about Raspberry Blitz being really cool, and also Urbit. I'm kind of curious now. I want to take a look at it, see if I can grok it.
Yeah, you try and figure it out, and then I'll bring you on with BSG, and we can do an Urbit show.
No, but back to what Jonas was saying. It's been a pleasure being on, Matt. Just like I reminisce to the bear market times of 2018, and you guys, TFTC, Stefan Livera, Block Digest, pretty much got me through. Everything else was kind of shitcoiny. So it's amazing to see what these quote unquote podcasts have blossomed to be as like communities now.
No, the pleasure is all mine. So let's jump into your autism. What do you got for us?
Yeah, you know how me and P roll. So Jonas, because you're into this Taproot stuff, and you happen to be one of these BIP authors. I'm curious, what's up with signatures these days? I'll be in the DMs with Shinobi once in a while. He'll be floating some other random rig signature stuff. I watched some half aggregation stuff that you posted that may be used for gossip, and then also music could be used for gossip. So would love to dive deep into the signature rabbit hole and potentially end at like where threshold is at these days.
Wow, that's a whole nother 2-hour conversation. Okay, where are signatures these days? According to my best estimate, Taproot will activate sometime November 14th. So from then on, we will have Schnorr signatures on Bitcoin main chain, which will be really nice. Will be interesting to see how people are going to use it. Right now, I spend a lot of my time trying to make music usable. I talked a little bit earlier about it, which basically what it does is if you have a multi-sig, let's say a 2 of 2 in the Lightning case, then right now you would have to write both public keys. And then if you close the channel, both signatures on chain, which is both bad for privacy, and also it costs more money using Lightning that way, compared to having just a single public key and a single signature, which is what music would allow you to do. And this is what I hinted at earlier, that the Lightning people are really interested in making this upgrade once Taproot is or has landed on main chain. But of course, this all needs to be specced out, how exactly this is going to look like. So the Lightning people need to do that. But before they can do that, we also need to write a specification how exactly music should look like how do the various signers interact to actually aggregate their public keys and signatures into a single signature. So I'm working on that, implementing this in libsecp ZKP right now, which is a fork of libsecp, the library that Bitcoin Core uses, and also trying to spec it out. And there are also like regular wallet authors who would like to use music. There are some like having this. Some wallets provide multi-sig functionality, and they want to use music as well because they see it as a big advantage for their users if they have to pay less fees, and also if it isn't immediately obvious on chain that someone is using a multi-sig wallet, which I think is a really big benefit of these things. So that's in the music world, but there are many different things that we also want to do. You mentioned ring signatures. So interestingly, in SegWit v0, our current most recent address format, in order to spend it, you need to reveal the public key, because in the output of this coin or of this UTXO, there's only a hash of the public key, right? So that will change in Taproot, where the public key is barely written, or is written into the output of this coin. So that means there's no hashing involved. And this makes it simple to create ring signatures over the UTXO set. So how does that work? What does it mean? What you can do, for example, is let's say you have the UTXO set and you just filter the ones that are using Taproot, and then you look at the public keys, which is now possible because they're not hashed anymore. You end up with a list of public keys, and then you can create a ring. If one of the public keys is yours, then you can create a ring signature. And a ring signature over these public keys will prove that you own one of these public keys. One of them, but you don't reveal which one. And this could be interesting in various spam prevention schemes, because you don't have to reveal exactly which coin you own anymore. So, for example, there were some discussions on joint market fidelity bonds where you don't say exactly which output you own, but you say, I own this output. I own one of these outputs, but you don't say specifically which one you own. And that's something that's possible with Taproot. It was possible before, but basically computationally and complexity-wise, relatively infeasible. So I think that's an interesting research area to see how that could improve the privacy of these fidelity bonds, because these fidelity bonds, they are also suggested in the Lightning world quite a bit.
So yeah, okay. So if they're not hashes, essentially, are these points just like, I guess that it's almost like the multi-hop blocks or whatever I think I've seen you previously talk about. And then secondly, this is what's like commonly referred to as like liquidity pools or whatever, right? Like if you can prove that you own part of that fidelity bond.
I haven't heard the word liquidity pool before. Perhaps liquidity, something liquidity, but not pool. Huh.
Okay, maybe mixing two concepts, but
there are liquidity ads.
Not that, but that'd
okay.
be cool too.
You mean like a non-set, right?
Well, essentially, because you're pooling, you can still pool capital in a sense of like how he was mentioning the fidelity bond, where you just have one of the keys, right?
Yep. So this isn't
I
something
see
that
what
would
you're
happen
saying.
on chain. It's totally off chain. I mean, basically Monero is kind of similar, but there it's really on chain, where you prove that you own one of these input coins, but you don't reveal which one, and you do that with a ring signature. But here it would be just off chain to prove that you own some coin without revealing which one. Okay, and another topic that you mentioned was aggregation.
Yes. About
Okay.
gossip. Yep.
Okay, so as I said, I'm not that deep into the technical Lightning community, but it seems that one kind of problem is that in the Gossip network, your channel announcements are relatively large. And that's because the channel announcements contain multiple signatures, multiple public keys, in order to prove, for example, that you own a coin on chain, to make this message resistant against spam, because you don't want anyone to just send any message, because that would bring down the Gossip network very quickly. So you're only supposed to send a message if you can prove that you have a coin on chain, and that's basically your spam prevention method. Now, the current channel announcements, they are relatively big. The question is, how can you reduce the size of these? And one thing that they include is, for example, they include the public keys of both nodes that open the channel, and also signatures from both nodes. So you could use this music technique I mentioned earlier to make both public keys into one public key, and also both signatures into one signature. And that way you already save a lot of space, but you can go further. So music is essentially a way to have multiple parties sign the same message. But there's also the concept of signature aggregation. And when we talk about that, we usually mean there are multiple people signing a different message. So what could happen is that each of these there are channel announcements, gossiped, and each of these channel announcements has a signature, but and this signature signs the channel announcement itself. But what if you could have a batch of channel announcements, each having a signature, and aggregate these signatures together into a smaller signature? And that's something that would be possible with the concept of half aggregation. Because half aggregation doesn't need cooperation with the signers. So you can take a bunch of signatures and just aggregate them into one half aggregated signature. It's half as big as the individual signatures combined. And this would already give you quite a lot. You could go even further than that using full aggregation. And this is only on the Lightning Gossip network, so perhaps one day this could also be used on the Bitcoin consensus layer to reduce the size of transactions, where you have one signature per transaction as opposed to one signature per input.
Is that am I mixing concepts up, or is that cross signature input aggregation?
That's cross input signature aggregation, exactly. CISA.
And that would be particularly helpful for CoinJoin.
This would be helpful for CoinJoin because now it makes sense to create larger transactions and pool your inputs with other people, because then you if you imagine an infinitely large CoinJoin, then your cost, your fee that you pay for the signature is essentially zero, because you don't have a signature anymore. It's aggregated into everyone else's signature. But actually, the advantage that you get is not that big. So that's something that That would be interesting to see in a world where we have signature aggregation, because the signature is relatively large, right? It's 64 bytes, but it's also already in the witness, right? So it's also 64 witness units, weight units. In terms of weight units, your game isn't that big. In terms of bytes, okay, your transaction will get smaller, but in terms of weight units, I think in the infinite coin join example, you would get like 18% reduction in weight for an average transaction, and weight would also translate into fees, so an 18% reduction in fees.
So therefore, it effectively make people want to do this as like a de facto or default versus doing it the other way. In a sense where you opt into a coin join, you'd essentially be of the mindset to opt out for some reason.
Right now, CoinJoin costs more than a regular transaction. In this world, CoinJoin would cost less than a naive Bitcoin transaction, right?
Exactly. I mean, there are also downsides, of course, of doing a coin join with other people. So it's like a question of I mean, in terms of usability, right? It takes longer to create a coin join, for example, because people need to interact and need to send these signatures around. That's a downside. So the question is like, is the upside worth it? But yeah, it's also, it just gives you a good reason to coin join, because now it's not just how do we call them earlier? The dark people anymore with the hoodies, because now it's everyone who just want to save
The
some
dark
fees.
people.
Yeah.
I mean, it could work well.
Like,
I'm thinking like specifically for like Lightning opens, right? Because they're more low time preference transactions where people are already online anyway.
So this goes back to like I left out one podcast that also got me through the bear market, Matt. It was Noted, and there is a glorious episode, with Bidstein, Pierre Richard, and an ex-block streamer called Johnny Dilly, and he goes into this in depth, essentially where the holy grail is, some sort of batching in a sense, where every channel open or channel close is also a coin join because it's economically incentivized.
I mean, that's the meme, right? Every transaction a coin join. I heard it on Rabbit Hole Recap. I've been spreading it before that as well. And even better is every channel, Lightning channel open should be a coin join in the ideal world, where you have multi-party channels, dual funding channels, and whatever. And if that's cheaper than not doing that, then that's even better. But I mean, even in terms of bytes, like for the network, it gets you a lot. It's like a 40% reduction in the just size of transaction in bytes. So that's already a huge thing.
I just want to say I miss Noted. What a good show.
Yeah. I mean,
we had Johnny Dilly on TFTC as well. That was an in-person rip in New York. That was a fucking fire rip.
Oh yeah, that was really good. That too.
So I mean, guys, this has been a absolutely fantastic conversation. We are hitting the 2.5 hour mark. You think we should just wrap up with some final thoughts?
Sure. I know it's probably getting late for the other two.
Yeah, let's start with Nick's Bitcoin Dev. Final thoughts. Boom.
Wow. Okay. I was just thinking about Matrix because somebody was writing about Telegram. And I think this is a chance to make a bigger point that Nix Bitcoin is the node for the digitally sovereign, the people who want to have full control up down to the hardware, and also want to have an overview over how it works technically, while at the same time not having to become expert system administrators to have an extremely secure configuration. So with that in mind, it's also probably right now not for the super noobish people, but I hope that once we get the project to a certain finish line, we can start, or it's probably going to be me because Jonas and Eric are more on the technical side, start making more documentation for migration and just in general, different use cases and how to do it. And yeah, we're building on a good foundation, on a good technical foundation right now. And rather than doing it vice versa, rather than getting users involved and then trying to improve the technical foundation.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick's Bitcoin Dev. Vivek, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess nobody's untouchable, no plan is foolproof, software will break. That's why we strive for FOSS, that's why we strive for agnostic implementation of anything that we're interested in. That's why I was drawn towards Nick's Bitcoin. I will be not only releasing the tutorial for this after submitting it with Jonas Nick for making sure I'm doing everything properly. I'll also be speaking about it at TabConf later this week. But just really find a FOSS project or something in this community that interests you, and see if there's some way you can contribute to it, and just try to build. I think I've heard Nick's Bitcoin say this before. Cypherpunks write code. Twitter's fun, but someone's actually got to roll up their sleeves and walk the walk. So much love to everyone that does it and walks the walk.
Fuck yeah. Enjoy TabConf. It looks fantastic.
I'm going to miss you.
Thank you, Vivek. Jonas, final thoughts.
I have a lot of fun developing Nick's Bitcoin. It's a great side project. The lows are very low too. I would still would generally recommend to have a look at NixOS. I think it is a game changer in many ways. If you stepped over a certain point, you don't want to get back into regular Linux or regular system administration. The general NixOS community is really large and also great. I'm going to continue doing this because I'm going to continue running a Bitcoin node, and somehow it needs to be managed, and that's going to continue to be through Nick's Bitcoin. If people want to join this project, would be really cool to see you on GitHub or Matrix.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonas. I want to thank the Ride or Die Freaks for being in the live chat and hanging in here with us and being a part of the show. You guys are what make it unique. And I want to thank all of you who choose to support the show and keep it ad-free and sponsor-free so we can focus on actionable Bitcoin discussion. It is truly special. As I said in the beginning of the episode, I know I've been traveling and our Bitcoin Tuesday schedule has been in flux, but we're going hard into the winter months. So expect a lot of more great discussions on our Bitcoin Tuesdays. I want to thank our guests, Nick's Bitcoin Dev, Vivek, and Jonas, for joining us. I really do appreciate all the work you guys do in the space. I hope you come back on in the future, not only to follow up on this project, but also for future autistic discussion. I'm looking forward to that. And just thank you guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
That was our boy Logic, Ride or Die Bitcoiner. Will be joining us at Bitcoin 2022 for the first Bitcoin Infused Music Festival, April 6th through 9th. Ticket prices go up tomorrow. You get $100 off if you buy with Bitcoin. You get an additional 21% off if you use code open source. I do not make any money from that code. That was not an ad read. I am helping them organize it. Love you all, freaks. We'll be back for Bitcoin Tuesday next week with Bitcoin Q&A, and I'll see you all for Rabbit Hole Recap on Thursday. Stay humble, stack sats.